Hey, welcome to Agnes Thompson's channel. My name's Martha, and I'm going to share my story with you.
My family went bankrupt chasing VR dreams. I warned them. They laughed. Then I saved them. At 67, I've always believed that life, much like a good, aged whiskey, reveals its true value in simplicity. Not simplicity for simplicity's sake, but the clarity that emerges from decades of careful observation, inevitable mistakes, and lessons absorbed slowly, like dew melting on a summer dawn. I live in a quiet Atlanta suburb in Georgia, in a house that has witnessed so many stories, from my son David's first steps to the quiet evenings George, my late husband, and I spent on the porch. Here, time itself seemed to flow at its own unhurried pace. Yet, it's 2025, and outside my window, the world was rushing by at a dizzying, frantic speed. More and more often, it felt like my wisdom, those very kernels of truth I had carefully gathered and yearned to share, were becoming invisible to those I loved most. They were blinded by the glitter of novelty, deafened by the roar of the digital age. My days were woven from familiar, yet deeply comforting rituals. I greeted the early morning in my garden, watching the first sunbeams dance on the petals of azaleas and magnolias, transforming them into living paintings. I talked to my plants as if they were old friends, feeling the earth return its nourishing power to me. Then, twice a week, I'd head to the local public library. My role there was surprising. I helped other seniors, much like myself, master new technologies, tablets, smartphones, the basics of internet safety. Sometimes, I felt less like a librarian and more like an interpreter, translating the language of the digital future into common sense. I saw how the fear of the new made them withdraw, and how a small, seemingly simple step could open up a whole world of possibilities. I understood that the key to progress wasn't just about embracing the new, but also about preserving the value of what had stood the test of time. But my greatest joy and simultaneously my greatest worry was my family. My dear David, now in his early 40s, was a software engineer, a profession that seemed to embody the very essence of this new century. His wife, Sarah, headed the marketing department at a major tech company. They had 2 children, my grandchildren. Emily, who had just turned 20, was attending a prestigious university, and 17-year-old Jacob was a typical 2025 high schooler, born, it seemed, with a smartphone attached to his hand. I was genuinely proud of their energy, their ability to navigate this rapidly changing world, their ambition and accomplishments. Yet, behind this dazzling facade, I saw something that troubled me to my core, a shadow that increasingly fell across their faces. It was the shadow of financial anxiety. They lived in a large, modern house in an upscale neighborhood, which looked like it belonged in a luxury magazine spread. They drove new electric cars, constantly upgraded their gadgets, and their wardrobes and home appliances were always at the height of fashion. It seemed they never denied themselves or their children the best of anything. Gourmet dinners ordered via Gourmet Express apps, expensive educational courses for the kids, overseas trips every vacation. They lived as if there were no tomorrow. But I heard their phone conversations, filled with worries about rising credit card debts, monthly mortgage payments on a variable rate loan, and unexpected expenses that constantly knocked them off balance. They were always searching for quick fixes, lucrative investments, the latest trends in the crypto market or in startups that promised instant riches or a magical escape from their predicament. They were chasing the ghosts of easy money, and this chase was dragging them deeper and deeper into a mire. My wisdom, which I cherished so deeply, was entirely different. It resided in my old, worn ledger, which I had kept since the early 1970s. It wasn't just a book of income and expenses, it was a living chronicle of my financial life, reflecting the ebbs and flows of the nation's economy, the value of every dollar saved, the meaning behind every thoughtful, non-impulsive purchase. My late husband, George, always said, "Martha, you see money not just as numbers on paper. You feel its pulse, its breath. You understand that it's a living organism that needs to be nurtured and grown." I had learned to anticipate economic cycles, to see how small, consistent actions, like drops of water, could wear away stone, creating a massive, long-term effect. I understood that preparing for a rainy day wasn't paranoia, but the best investment in peace of mind. My approach wasn't about complex algorithms and high technology, but about patience, discipline, and basic common sense, which seemed to be lost in their glittering, digital world. I tried to convey this to them. A few months ago, when David and Sarah hinted at their struggles with Emily's tuition, college, even with a scholarship, was prohibitively expensive, and they already had accumulated student loans, I saw my chance. Perhaps we should sit down and look at your budget? I cautiously suggested one evening when we were having dinner at their house. The aroma of their exquisite takeout dinner, ordered through the Gourmet Express app, filled the air. I could show you some things that have helped me my whole life. There are a few simple principles that might seem old-fashioned now, but they've stood the test of time, survived more than one crisis. David, preoccupied with checking stock market quotes on his enormous monitor that took up almost an entire living room wall, barely waved me off, his gaze fixed on the flickering charts. "Mom, we've tried that already," he said with a hint of weariness in his voice, as if I were suggesting he reinvent the wheel. "Your ledgers and saving principles, they're very sweet, truly. But this is 2025. The economy has changed. It's digital, global, dynamic. You have to be agile, invest in innovation, in breakthrough technologies, not count every penny and sit on a pile of cash. That's a last-century approach." Sarah, who was scrolling through her news feed on her ultra-thin Zenith Edge tablet, didn't even look up. "Yes, Martha," she added, her voice detached, as if she were responding to a voice assistant, not me. "We're consulting with a financial advisor. He has advanced AI algorithms that analyze thousands of data points per second, predict market trends, optimize portfolios. Your approach is too manual, you know? Too analog. It's just not efficient in the modern world. We can't afford to slow down while these algorithms do all the work for us." Emily, who sat next to me, eyes glued to her laptop where she was simultaneously listening to an online lecture on digital marketing and the impact of artificial intelligence, and chatting with friends in multiple windows, patted my hand with a smile. "Grandma, you're awesome, really. You're so sweet. But now everyone's into crypto, NFTs, startups that promise to grow 100-fold in a month. We have to take risks to get ahead, to secure our future. Your advice, well, it's too simple for that. It doesn't match the speed of our world." Jacob, who spent most of dinner with headphones on, immersed in the virtual reality of the multiplayer online game, Ethereverse Battlegrounds, didn't even lift his head. His world was completely consumed by pixels and the sounds of battle, and my simple advice probably seemed as archaic to him as a telegraph machine or an abacus. I might as well have given them a lecture on the benefits of rotary phones. Her advice is too simple. I could almost hear them scoff, even if the words weren't spoken aloud. It hurt. Not because I wanted to control them or lecture them, but because I saw them cornering themselves with their belief that complexity, novelty, and speed were always better. They were convinced that the more advanced and technological the advice, the more valuable it was. My decades of experience, my simple principles, seemed naive, irrelevant to them. They preferred to trust faceless algorithms and young, ambitious, financial gurus from the internet who promised instant fortunes, rather than the wisdom of someone who had dedicated her life to caring for her family and had navigated the fires and floods of several economic downturns. They were trapped in a cycle of endless consumption and a constant race for new, faster, and brighter trends. And every step they took, every new purchase, every innovative investment only dragged them deeper into a financial hole from which they saw no escape. I felt a deep pang of disappointment, but I didn't give up. I knew my wisdom wasn't outdated. It was fundamental, like the roots of an old, mighty oak that stands for centuries, enduring any storm. I decided that direct instruction, like trying to teach a fish to fly, wouldn't work. I needed to find another, more creative and subtle way. A way that would allow them to see the value of my knowledge not through words, but through action. I needed them to feel its necessity, not just hear it. I began to observe them even more closely, like a scientist studying the behavior of rare birds. I watched their financial decisions, their habits, their vulnerabilities. I started gathering information, not invading their privacy, but simply listening carefully to snippets of conversations, reading local and national news, analyzing changes in the local economy that no one else, it seemed, noticed but me. It was easy for me. I had long developed this observational skill working with other seniors at the library, where sometimes I heard the most surprising things. I felt something big was coming, something they were utterly unprepared for. Something that would cause their world, built on shaky sandcastles of fast money, to crumble. And when it happened, my too simple advice might be their only salvation, the only straw they could grasp. I couldn't tell them what I was going to do, or what would happen. This was my path, forged by life experience, intuition, and a deep, unconditional love for my family. I needed to act cautiously, without arousing suspicion, so that at the right moment, my help would not only be accepted but understood, so they would finally see it not just as old-fashioned advice, but as a lifeline. The feeling of an impending storm hung in the air, like the suffocating August heat in Georgia that drains the city's strength and leaves everything languishing in anticipation of relief. Months had passed since that dinner when my too simple advice was discarded like useless clutter. I watched David and Sarah, like two lost ships, equipped with the latest technology, but lacking a compass, drift deeper into the fog of financial uncertainty. Their house, once a gleaming symbol of success and prosperity, now seemed to me a huge, unbearable burden, consuming all their income and demanding more and more. Every new gadget, every streaming service subscription, every expensive vacation only further tethered them to this financial anchor. I saw them, as if mesmerized by sirens, invest in what they called a groundbreaking investment, a virtual reality startup called Ethereaverse Incorporated. "Mom, this is the future," David explained excitedly on the phone to his friend, unaware that I was sitting in the next room. "It's not just a game, it's an entire ecosystem. Our financial advisor, Marcus, said it's a guaranteed jump. He showed us such charts, such projections. It's insane what kind of growth awaits us." Sarah was also enthusiastic when we discussed their plans over a rare joint breakfast. She envisioned luxurious vacations in private villas, a carefree old age without a single thought about money, all brought about by this guaranteed jump. I listened and nodded, but inside, everything clenched. My old ledger whispered to me about the dangers of speculative bubbles, about how guaranteed returns most often led to guaranteed losses, and that the loudest promises often turned out to be the emptiest. I remembered the dot-com bubble of the early 2000s, the housing crisis of 2008. The schemes were different, but the basic psychology the same. Meanwhile, their daily expenses continued to grow, like a hungry beast. Emily, my smart granddaughter, worked hard at her studies, but even her part-time job at the local Brew and Bites cafe didn't cover all her college expenses, textbooks, dorm fees, student activity fees, endless extra spending. She talked about needing a new, more powerful laptop for her studies, about a spring break trip with classmates, and I saw how David and Sarah strained, trying to fulfill all her wishes, despite the clear lack of funds. "We have to give the kids everything they deserve," Sarah insisted, but her eyes betrayed her weariness. Jacob, meanwhile, spent even more time in his virtual world of Ethereaverse, and I felt that he lacked the real interaction, the genuine attention he craved but couldn't get. The tension between David and Sarah became palpable, like a taut string. Short, sharp phrases, discontented glances, awkward silences at dinner as they tried to avoid conversations about bills, all of it indicated that financial stress was eroding the foundations of their marriage. My plan began to form, like a pattern on antique lace, slowly, but with unyielding precision. I understood that direct persuasion and lecturing were useless, like trying to stop a tsunami with one hand. I needed to create conditions in which my simple wisdom would become not just advice, but their only salvation, their last chance. I didn't want them to suffer, but I needed them to understand that true value lay not in fleeting brilliance, but in a solid foundation. I began gathering information, like a spider spinning its web, slowly, cautiously, but steadily. My old-fashioned methods were my advantage. Conversations with neighbors at the supermarket while we picked out vegetables, reading local newspapers they usually didn't bother to pick up, even observing real estate listings in their neighborhood, all of it gave me pieces of the puzzle. I knew their neighborhood, Greenwood Park, was built with relatively new houses that had sold at inflated prices a few years ago, when mortgage rates were record lows. My intuition, based on decades of observing the Georgia real estate market, told me that a serious correction might happen soon. I remembered how in 2008, houses cost half as much as the year before, and while the current situation was different, the general patterns of speculative growth and subsequent collapse were familiar to me. I paid attention to news that the Federal Reserve was not just hinting, but actively raising interest rates, which could affect their variable rate mortgage if they had one. And I was almost certain they did the one that seemed most advantageous at first glance. I also noticed that the local Atlanta Motors plant, the largest employer in the county, was struggling due to declining demand for traditional vehicles, and this could affect property values overall. I also closely followed news about regulations in the tech sector. My internet skills, which I honed at the library helping others, came in handy for me too. I read reports about possible tightening of rules for startups, especially those involving venture capital and public offerings. I looked for hidden details, fine print in financial news that their progressive financial consultants might miss, too engrossed in the glimmer of new technologies. I compared their modern investments in Ethereumverse Incorporated with historical data I kept in my ledger, and I saw alarming parallels with past bubbles that had burst, leaving behind ruins and disappointment. I noticed that startups promising too much, too fast, almost always ended the same way. My preparation was as inconspicuous as a shadow dance at sunset. I wasn't saving money for them directly. Instead, I began to apply my simple principles in my own modest life to demonstrate their effectiveness. I knew that example, even unspoken, was far more powerful than 1,000 words. I found I could cut my monthly expenses by 10 to 15% without sacrificing my quality of life, simply by reviewing my streaming service subscriptions. I had 3 of them, choosing more advantageous utility rates, using coupons at the grocery store, buying produce on sale, and cooking more at home instead of ordering takeout. I invested these savings into what I always considered most reliable, local municipal bonds, which offered a stable, albeit small, return about 2% annually. It was boring, not trendy, but predictable and stable. I also discovered that one of my old neighbors, Mr. Henderson, was selling a small plot of land, only half an acre, that had been neglected for years and used as a dumping ground for old car tires. The plot was small, but it was on the outskirts of town where, according to my analysis of local development plans published in an obscure city bulletin, a new transportation hub was supposed to be built. I bought it for a symbolic sum of $1,000, based on my intuition and knowledge of local planning, as well as old, almost forgotten land zonings I remembered from my grandfather, who had been a land surveyor. This wasn't for personal profit, but rather to have a small, yet reliable ace up my sleeve if my premonitions came true, and for this plot to become the key to their salvation. I also cautiously tried to guide conversations, dropping small seeds of information. You know, I read that many companies that seemed unsinkable are now starting to cut staff, freeze hiring. I casually remarked one day when David was complaining about overtime, hinting at trends in the tech industry. All this talk about a bubble in the tech market, it's not just talk. History needs to be studied, David. It always repeats itself. My words were met with polite but condescending nods. Grandma, those are just alarmists and dinosaurs who don't understand the digital economy, Sarah replied, changing the subject. Our sector is only growing. It's not subject to crises like old industries. We are the future. I couldn't cause a financial crisis in their lives, but I could foresee it and prepare for it in such a way that my wisdom would become not just advice, but the only answer, a saving beacon in a stormy sea. I knew their vulnerability lay in their over-reliance on fast and trendy solutions that were inflexible and vulnerable to systemic shocks. My first attempt to nudge them was subtle, almost imperceptible. I'd heard David mention a new app their financial advisor, Marcus, recommended for hyper-optimized budgeting, promising to save them thousands. I knew such apps often had hidden fees or pushed users towards specific high-risk investments. I did my own research, finding an obscure clause in its terms of service about mandatory quarterly portfolio reevaluations that incurred substantial charges, even if no changes were made. David, Sarah, I'd said one afternoon, holding a printed copy of the app CULA. I was looking into that new budget app you mentioned. Did you see Section 4? 3? The quarterly reevaluation fee seems quite steep, especially if it doesn't align with your actual needs. David barely glanced at the paper. Mom, it's AI-driven. It's supposed to optimize everything. Marcus assured us it's standard. We just follow its recommendations. Sarah nodded in agreement, eyes glued to her phone. It was a clear dismissal, a polite but firm rejection of my simple scrutiny. They signed up for the app, and within 2 months, they'd paid nearly $500 in fees alone, with no visible improvement in their budget. It was frustrating, a tiny setback that confirmed their unwavering faith in technology over common sense. But it taught me that I had to wait for a larger, undeniable crisis. The main problem I felt looming over them was their inability to adapt to changing tax legislation and their habit of ignoring the fine print. I read every line of the new federal tax bill, the Income and Investment Stabilization Act, which was to take effect in the next fiscal year. In Section 7b, it spoke of revising tax rules for innovative investments that had not yielded stated returns within the first 18 months, and of increasing property tax for homes with a certain market value in areas classified as rapidly developing under the new assessment system. Their home in Greenwood Park fell under this definition, and their investments in Ethereverse Incorporated could be reclassified from innovative to speculative with huge tax liabilities. None of their trendy consultants, it seemed, had paid attention to this, too caught up in growth forecasts and new technologies to delve into the boring details of the tax code. They relied on automatic software updates, not meticulous study. I saw their guaranteed jump turning into a guaranteed fall, and that this fall would be amplified by an unexpected blow from the tax system that they couldn't have foreseen, being preoccupied with only one side of the coin. They were trapped in this labyrinth, and I knew that without my simple approach, they wouldn't find a way out. My heart ached with foreboding, but I knew this was the only way to convey my truth to them, so they would not only survive but also learn. I held my cards close to my chest, knowing that any premature word could only deepen their rejection and strengthen their mistaken conviction. The tension mounted. David became irritable, often snapping over trifles. Sarah grew pale, tired, her always impeccable hairstyle often looking disheveled now. I watched them try to cope, seeking new quick fixes, but every action they took only tightened the noose around their necks. Their modern strategies were fine in a stable world, when everything went according to plan, but utterly useless in the face of a real, unpredictable threat that didn't fit into any algorithm. But what I learned or did next turned all expectations upside down. You won't believe how it ended. Even when it seemed all was lost, I didn't give up. The next part of the story will reveal everyone's true colors. The air in David and Sarah's house was so thick you could almost touch it. The doorbell rang like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon as I stopped by to bring them fresh cinnamon rolls, baked from my late grandmother's recipe. The mood was grim, electrified with a premonition of disaster. Dinner the night before had been tense, words, if spoken at all, were clipped and sharp. Emily, my smart granddaughter, was talking about having to take a leave of absence from college to find a job, as paying for the next semester was in serious doubt, despite her excellent grades and part-time work. Jacob was in his room, the sounds of a fierce online game echoing from within, and I knew it was his way of walling himself off from the mounting anxiety in the house. A mask of panic solidified on David's face as he lowered the phone, which he held with knuckles white from tension. Sarah stood nearby, hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. It's the tax authorities, Mom," David whispered, his voice trembling, each word seemingly forced out with immense effort. "They sent us a huge bill. For reclassifying our investment in that VR startup, they called them speculative assets with zero return. And for the revaluation of our house. They say that because of the new federal Income and Investment Stabilization Act, our home is now considered luxury real estate in a rapidly developing area, and we owe hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional taxes, immediately. And our Ethereumverse Incorporated, it crashed. Just collapsed overnight. It was a bubble, just like you said, Mom. We didn't get a single cent back from what we invested. Nothing at all. Sarah slowly sank onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders trembled. We're bankrupt, she sobbed, her voice barely audible. We've lost everything. Our financial advisor, Marcus, he just stopped answering calls. His office is closed. He said everything was under control, that it was a guaranteed jump. What are we going to do, Martha? What are we going to tell the kids? Emily will have to drop out of college, and Jacob. Oh God. Their voices were filled with despair, raw and unbearable. I felt their pain, their fear, their sense of utter collapse. This was exactly the blow I had dreaded. Their modern solutions, their faith in instant riches and foolproof algorithms, had crumbled, leaving them in ruins. They were completely devastated. Their high-tech world couldn't protect them from basic financial realities, from the simple truth that you can't build a castle on sand. I went over to them, knelt beside them, and placed my hands on their trembling shoulders. Do you remember that ledger I told you about? I asked calmly, my voice quiet but firm, like an old stone that cannot be moved. And those simple principles you scoffed at? The principles of foresight, caution, and preparing for the worst, which seemed so naive to you. David lifted his tear-swollen eyes to mine. Disbelief still lingered in them. Martha, what's the point of talking about that now? It won't help. We've already lost everything. We don't even know where to get money for a lawyer to try to postpone bankruptcy. You're wrong, David, I replied, looking him straight in the eye. That's exactly what will help. It will help not only now but in the future. I walked to the kitchen, took out my old, worn leather bag, which I had carried since my youth, and extracted my ledger from it, along with a carefully folded folder containing several important documents, kept safe in plastic sleeves. I placed everything on the kitchen table. Sarah, David, sit down, I said, and this time they obeyed without question. Emily, who seemed to have been listening at the door, tentatively entered the kitchen. I saw this coming, I began, opening the ledger to the right page, filled with my neat handwriting. Not this specific startup, of course, but a bubble like this, yes. I've seen them many times. And the changes in tax legislation. They were there, in the fine print, in Section 7B of the Income and Investment Stabilization Act, which no one bothered to read except people like me. So I prepared while you chased ghosts. I opened my ledger. Do you remember when you bought this house in Greenwood Park? I asked, pointing to an old entry. It was in late 2018. You took out a variable rate mortgage because it was cheaper by a few tenths of a %. I told you then, remember. Kids, consider a fixed rate. Yes, it's more expensive now, but it will protect you when rates go up, and they will go up. It's not a question of if, but when. History always repeats itself. You dismissed it as excessive caution then. David nodded, recalling how casually he had brushed off my words back then. Yes, Mom, we thought it was excessive caution and foolishness. And do you remember, I continued, pulling one of the documents from the plastic folder, when a few years ago I urged you to transfer some of your savings, which you kept in that venture fund, into municipal bonds? I told you it was reliable, even if it offered a small percentage. You said it was too slow and outdated, that you needed fast money. Yes, Grandma, we remember, Emily said softly, standing behind David and Sarah, her eyes fixed on my movements as if she were watching a magic trick. Good, I said, handing David a piece of paper. This is a copy of a deed of gift, dated 1998, and here are the current ownership papers. This plot of land, where your house stands, was once part of my grandmother's large estate. In 1998, long before you bought it, I, following my grandfather's advice, he was a far-sighted man, transferred ownership of a small, undeveloped parcel of land, the very one bordering your backyard, to the Martha Smith Family Trust, with the condition that it could not be sold without my consent and was intended to prevent unforeseen financial difficulties for heirs. This was my insurance, which no one knew about. David and Sarah stared at me blankly, then at the document, as if trying to decipher an ancient letter. This plot, I continued, pointing my finger at the diagram, falls under a completely different tax category. It's still classified as agricultural land thanks to old zoning laws that I kept in the county archive. And, as you remember, I bought it back from Mr. Henderson for a symbolic sum 6 months ago when I saw it might come in handy. It was neglected, but its zoning was the key. Here's the conclusion from the lawyer I consulted, my old acquaintance, John Mitchell. He confirmed that in case of exorbitant tax burden, like yours, you can apply for a reassessment of your home's cadastral value by adding this plot. It won't cancel the entire tax, but it will significantly reduce it by shifting part of the tax burden to this agricultural plot, which I just sold to you for $1, registered as a conditional gift from the trust fund. This is a loophole in the new tax legislation that very few people know about because it concerns old zonings and rare types of transactions. Your modern consultants wouldn't have known about it because it doesn't fit into their algorithms. It's not digital, it's historical. And then I came to the most important part, what I knew could either destroy or save them. And now about your Ethereaverse Incorporated startup, I said, taking out another document, a printed article from an old economic journal, bookmarked in my ledger. When you talked about it, I couldn't help but notice that its business model, those promises of a virtual ecosystem and unlimited growth, was very similar to one of the bubbles that burst in the early 2000s. I kept all the articles and analyses from that time in my ledger, studied them, and realized that the patterns were repeating like a bad song. I knew they would collapse. It was only a matter of time and a trigger. But that's not all. Remember when I told you to diversify your investments and you insisted on putting everything into this startup? My too simple advice, which you ignored, was not just about not putting all your eggs in one basket, but also about always having an emergency fund in case of a total collapse. I specifically sold my old Coca-Cola stocks, which I had held since my youth, when their value peaked, and put the funds into the most conservative, guaranteed investment product available, AUS, Treasury bill. It gave me a modest, but guaranteed return and was absolutely liquid. It was boring, yes, but it was reliable. David and Sarah stared at me, their faces slowly shifting from despair to shock, and then to deep, painful realization. In their eyes, I could read their understanding of how superficially they had regarded my words. At the same time, my voice softened as I moved to another facet of my simple wisdom when I saw Jacob withdrawing more and more due to your financial problems and lack of attention. I contacted his school psychologist, Dr. Richardson. He mentioned a support program for families facing financial difficulties, which included free counseling for children and teenagers. I arranged several sessions for Jacob, and it seems he's already starting to open up a bit because he feels listened to. This advice was also too simple about looking at people, at their emotional well-being, not just at numbers and income. Because money is only a means to well-being, not well-being itself. The climax came when I showed them the last document, as if pulling a rabbit out of a hat. You think your only loss is your startup and these taxes. But I foresaw something much worse. When you were about to invest all your savings into that startup, I hinted that you should keep some funds in an easily accessible fund for emergency medical care. You brushed it off, saying you had excellent Medicare plus insurance and that Emily and Jacob were healthy. But you forgot that in 2025, many insurance companies changed their terms, adding hidden deductibles and limitations on treatments for rare diseases. I studied all the new terms, talking to people at the library who had faced similar issues, and realized there was a huge hole in your plan, especially regarding rare childhood illnesses that require specialized, very expensive treatment, not fully covered even by excellent plans. That's why I secretly, on the same day you invested in the startup, transferred funds from my old savings account, which I had been accumulating since my first husband, Joe, into a special medical fund. This fund doesn't yield high interest, but it can cover those very unforeseen expenses. I foresaw that if Emily or Jacob suddenly fell seriously ill, you would be completely helpless. God forbid, of course, but I couldn't take the risk. It was this simple foresight, which you ignored for many years, that would have saved you from an even greater catastrophe if it had happened simultaneously with the startup's collapse. You wouldn't have had a single cent to save your child. This fund, that's what you rejected because it was too simple and boring, not bringing in millions overnight. David and Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears not of despair, but of revelation, deep remorse, and immense gratitude. They understood. My simplicity was not naivete, but a profound, timeless understanding of the world. My wisdom was not outdated, but fundamental, unshakable. Martha, David whispered, kneeling before me, his voice choked with sobs. Mom, forgive us. We were so blind, so foolish. We thought we were smarter than you, that our world was different. We thought these new technologies, these quick fixes, that was all we needed. You saved us. From everything. Not just from debt, but from our own foolishness. Sarah hugged me tightly, her tears mixing with mine on my cheeks. You were always right, Martha. We were just too dazzled by the glitter to see it. You gave us not just money, but a lifelong lesson. Emily approached and took my ledger, her fingers gently tracing the worn cover. Grandma, will you teach me? Will you show me how it works? I want to understand. I want to be as wise as you. Jacob emerged from his room, took off his headphones, and looked at me with a new, unfamiliar expression in his eyes, respect that could not be simulated. The crisis wasn't entirely over, but the worst was behind them. The tax bill, though significant, became manageable thanks to the legal loophole with the land plot I had discovered. The losses from the startup were painful but not fatal, because I had that very emergency fund that I had created from my own simple savings to help them pay off their most pressing debts and avoid complete bankruptcy. My life changed. My wisdom, once rejected and ridiculed, was finally embraced. Every week, David and Sarah, and now Emily too, gathered around the kitchen table. Using my old ledger, I explained the principles of long-term planning, the value of savings, the importance of diversification, understanding risks, and most importantly, the power of patience and foresight. We began slowly but surely to rebuild their finances, but more importantly, we rebuilt our family, its lost connections, its values. They no longer sought quick fixes, but learned to build a solid foundation, brick by brick. It was then, when they realized their mistake and reconnected, that it turned out my grandmother's wisdom had saved them not only from the current problem, but also prevented a much larger catastrophe they hadn't even suspected. And this was only revealed at the very end. My medical fund, created from my old, almost forgotten savings set aside for a rainy day since my first days of work in the 1970s, turned out to be the only salvation when, a few months later, Jacob suddenly ended up in the hospital with a rare but very serious infection requiring expensive treatment and lengthy rehabilitation, not fully covered by their new, improved insurance. Without my two simple, precautionary actions, they would have been utterly ruined, facing insurmountable medical bills that could have led to losing their home and the complete collapse of their lives. My wisdom was not only a way out of their financial hole, but also a shield that protected them from a blow they hadn't even suspected, and which proved far more devastating than all their previous problems. The ending wasn't just happy. It was real, profound, and meaningful. The family became stronger than ever. Laughter once again filled their home, but now it was filled not only with joy but with deep understanding and respect. And every time I saw David and Sarah check their expenses, meticulously plan their budget, or Emily leaf through my old ledger with interest, taking notes, or Jacob ask questions about how money works and how important it is to have a safety net, I knew that my wisdom, the very same that was too simple, had finally found its home, and its legacy would be passed down through generations.